Rise and speak on this interim report from the Privileges Committee. I would accept certainly one thing that the Attorney-General said in introducing his comments, which is that there were a number of very serious issues that arose during the Privileges Committee inquiry into these matters. It is important to note that this interim report is about establishing what happened in this particular incident, and therefore from that what we can learn about what went wrong and what changes are needed. So this part of the inquiry is very much grounded in what happened. And what happened was a sorry tale of an inquiry that quite frankly was a shambles from day one. And day one was the setting of the terms of reference for the inquiry, and that was done by John Key in accordance with Wayne Eagleson and Andrew Kibblewhite from DPMC and with Ian Fletcher from the GCSB. They were the people responsible for the setting of the terms of reference. We were told at the Privileges Committee that it was John Key as Prime Minister who signed off on the terms of reference. So let's set that right at the start, that this was John Key's inquiry. And those terms of reference were set in such a way that it was nearly impossible to find out who actually leaked the Kitteridge report, because the powers of that inquiry were set in such a way that Mr Henry was prevented from having people appear on oath or for any kind of subpoenaing situation, and that inevitably, given the small range of people who actually had access to the Kitteridge report, he was going to run into trouble. So the question was raised during the Privileges Committee hearings about whether or not the terms of reference were set up to really find out who leaked the Kitteridge report. And as at today, while we have somebody who is acknowledged by everybody from the Prime Minister down as the chief suspect, Peter Dunn, we don't actually know who leaked the Kitteridge report. And the Henry inquiry was set up in such a way that that was almost inevitably going to be the outcome beyond a stark confession from somebody in the process. And so Peter Dunn today is an MP and not a minister, but John Key has told us that it's quite possible he'll return as a minister. If John Key is comfortable with Peter Dunn returning as a minister, then he is implicitly saying that Peter Dunn didn't leak the report. That has to be the conclusion. And that means that this whole process, the Kitteridge report, the Henry inquiry, has left us none the wiser as to who leaked a sensitive, confidential document. And it's frankly slack leadership by the Prime Minister, willful blindness to what was actually going on in this case. And so the facts established in this inquiry were that all of Mr Henry's attention went to Mr Dunn, to Peter Dunn. But yet the Prime Minister is prepared to say today maybe he'll come back into Cabinet. I find that an unbelievable situation, Mr Speaker, and quite clearly the terms of reference, I believe, were set up in such a way that they were never going to get to the bottom of who actually leaked this report. The major issue that came out from the Privileges Committee investigation was around the blurring of the lines between the Executive and Parliament. The Parliamentary Service Commission Act actually says in its first few clauses that the Parliamentary Service Commission is not a branch of executive government. It's quite an unusual thing to find in an act, a negative statement about what the Parliamentary Service is not. But that's because it was set up very deliberately not to be able to be encumbered by the executive. And what we saw throughout the process of this inquiry was the blurring of those lines. Now, the blurring of those lines occurred once Parliamentary Service agreed to release information. And it's about ministers and their records. It's very important to note that 3 times the then head of the Parliamentary Service, Jeff Thorne, said he didn't want to release the information when he was asked. Firstly by the Henry inquiry, in two different ways by the Henry inquiry, and then by Janice Calvert from Ministerial Services. It was only when the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Wayne Eagleson, intervened on the 9th of May, as he does, Mr Mallard, on every occasion, as John Key has told this House, if you speak to my Chief of Staff, you're speaking to me. That's what John Key has told this House. So when Wayne Eagleson wrote to Jeff Thorne in an email and he said, further to our discussion, this is to confirm that the Prime Minister would like Parliamentary Service to make available to the inquiry team records from ministerial offices, photocopiers and any other relevant material requested. That's the Prime Minister blurring the lines between the Executive and Parliament. And that's what fundamentally went wrong here. And that phrase, any other material requested, became hugely significant as this inquiry went on. Because it is true that David Henry and his inquiry team overreached their mandate. There is no doubt about that. But that opened the door. Wayne Eagleson saying any other material requested was the Prime Minister telling Parliamentary Services this is how it will be. And so the fault for that blurring of the lines ultimately lies at the Prime Minister John Key's feet. And that has not been properly accepted, I don't believe, by the Prime Minister. So we have Jeff Thorne, we have David Henry, we have Wayne Eagleson, who are all part of the blurring of those lines. And I do support the comments of the Attorney-General with regard to the clarification of that. Within that, Mr Speaker, there was quite clearly a conflict about the different roles that people in Parliamentary Service were expected to play.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. The time has come for me to leave the chair for the dinner break. This debate is interrupted. I shall resume the chair at 7:30.